I've made it back to San Diego, and today I'm just going to show you a video on how to paint my most popular style of painting. It's an off-white, lightly distressed, but before I jump into that, I do want to go ahead and answer two questions that I get asked a lot. The first question is, do I have to sand my furniture before I paint it? And the answer is not usually. I prefer not to sand it because when you get a piece of furniture, typically it has a wood stain with a polyurethane over it. Now, when you put paint directly over that and you get into distressing, you're just lightly tapping your furniture with the sander, and what happens is it just chips up that top layer of paint, and what shows through is that nice wood stain. If you were to sand it prior to painting and then distress it, your wood underneath is usually going to be really light and it's just not going to show through your paint very well. Now, the second question I get asked a lot is, do I have to prime my furniture before I paint it? Again, the answer is not usually. I prefer not to. It makes the distressing process go by a lot easier, and because the paint that I do use has a primer in it, it is durable and it does stick to the wood. So the only time you should really be having to prime furniture is if the top layer of the wood has some sort of veneer to it where the paint just isn't sticking well, and even then you can do like a test patch just to see how your paint reacts to the wood and kind of go from there. Another question you might be wondering, why am I wearing this big ass hat? Well, I definitely blacked out from boredom and cut myself some beautiful quarantine bangs. Brad Mondo would be so disappointed in me. If you don't know who Brad Mondo is, you need to look him up. He's an absolute saint. But let's go ahead and get started. So I've gone ahead and I've laid everything out. The first thing I have is a power drill to remove all of the hardware. You don't need one, but it definitely makes the process go by quicker. I also have some screwdrivers in case the screws are stubborn. I have a flathead screwdriver and a Phillips head screwdriver. I'm also going to be needing a putty knife and a hammer today because my hardware does have plating on the back. To clean my furniture, I'm going to be using a solution of Dawn dish soap and water. You can use whatever you want as long as you clean your furniture before painting. Now, I won't be using these gloves, but if you're worried about ruining your nails, I definitely suggest using a pair. I'm also going to be using some wood putty and sandpaper to fill in those larger dents. Now, I have to make sure that this is a fine grit sandpaper because I definitely don't want to strip away that wood putty after I put it on. The paint that I'm using today is Valspar. The color is Oyster Pearl and I have it in a flat finish. The reason why I prefer a flat finish on my paint is because when you distress it, it will not change color versus like something that has a little bit of a sheen to it, such as like an eggshell or a gloss. When you distress those, typically they will change color depending on their undertone. The paintbrush that I'm going to be using today, it's a 2-inch paintbrush, and obviously it's well loved, but it definitely still has some life left in it. I'm also going to be using a mouse head sander today. Now, you can use any sander you want as long as it's not a rotating sander. If you use a rotating sander, it will strip away all of your paint and its dignity. The sandpaper I'm using is an 80 grit. It's a medium sandpaper. A fine grit can be used as well. To refinish my hardware, I do use a metallic paint. It comes in a variety of colors, but this one is my favorite color. To seal the furniture, I am using a clear satin enamel spray. I prefer a spray because it does dry really fast and it looks just as great as long as your coats are even. I'm also going to be needing a mask since I am working with stronger chemicals as well as sanding today. Other than that, it looks like I am good to go. Right now, I'm just removing all of the hardware and getting the furniture prepped to clean and paint.
Follow white rabbit. I'm taking potions, call me Alice.
To remove the hardware plating, I'm just going to wedge my putty knife underneath and gently tap it with the hammer until the small nails come loose and I can pop it right off.
Yeah, he stays late, but he leads me so I follow. Wandering around in Wonderland, wondering how or if I'll ever get back. Wandering around in Wonderland, wondering how or if I'll ever get back.
I'm going to be cleaning the furniture really well before I start painting. Now, when I clean furniture, I typically start to notice things that need to be fixed structurally, and right now is a good time to go ahead and do that. If you got your piece from a thrift store or a flea market, you might even find some goodies inside. Over the years, I've found everything from money to silver spoons.
Follow White Rabbit.
Next, I'm going to go ahead and fill in those larger dents. To do that, I'm going to take some putty on my putty knife and go ahead and fill it in. And then once I get enough in there, I'm going to use that putty knife and just scrape away any excess.
It's time for high tea. Madmen in hats and cats up in the trees.
Once that dries, I'm going to use that fine grit sandpaper just to smooth off the remaining excess putty. Now you can take that same piece of fine grit sandpaper and just run it across the top of your piece of furniture, and this will help remove any of those minor surface scratches. When I'm ready to paint, I always start with the drawers first. It's just habitual, and what I do is I just take my paintbrush and I work my way around the outer edges. If the drawers are dovetailed, I try not to get any paint on that, as I like to keep that detail original. Now just make sure there's not too much paint on your paintbrush, otherwise it'll drip everywhere, and then if it dries like that, you'll have to sand it down and start completely over. I went ahead and moved to my 3-inch paintbrush. That 2-inch has just reached the end of its lifespan, which is totally fine because I am painting a larger surface area anyway. When you dip your paintbrush in the paint, make sure it's not dripping and just wipe that excess off before you start painting. I typically start at the bottom and then work my way around the trim and eventually to the middle. If you notice some areas are thicker and then other areas are more sparse, just use your paintbrush to try to evenly distribute it as much as possible. Your first coat is just the base coat, so don't get too stressed out. The second coat is where the magic happens. There are little grooves in this furniture piece, and I prefer to leave a lot of them unpainted because I do feel like it adds a little bit more dimension to the paint job. I also don't fix every surface dent, and the reason for that, I just feel like it adds a little bit more character. I'm now starting on that second coat of paint. It's this coat that you really want to make sure that your paint is evenly distributed, although I do leave a couple patchy areas because I do feel like it adds a little bit more dimension. Yay, third and final coat. This coat is extremely quick. You're basically just going through and touching up any areas that you feel like might need a little bit more paint. I'm basically just repeating the exact same process on that smaller end table. Now I typically do not paint the back of furniture because sometimes with humidity paint can stick to the wall, but because this piece does have a lip, I kind of have to paint it because you can see it since it doesn't sit flush against the wall. I'm now moving on to my hardware. I do make sure the spray can is at least 8 inches away. If I don't do that, the paint will get extremely drippy and goopy, and it's a mess. Once my metallic coat dries, I'm going to repeat the same process with the satin sealer. If your hardware is double-sided, once the first side is dry, you're going to want to flip it over and repeat the same process all over again. I'm now taking that fine grit sandpaper and just cleaning up the edges of the doors for any paint that might have dripped inside. I'm now moving on to distressing, and to do that I'm just taking my mouse head sander and gently tapping the outer edges. The way I look at it is I like to distress the way that furniture would naturally distress and wear, which is typically the outer sides. Just make sure to never run your sander completely flat against the top of a surface because it will chip up the paint, and not in a way that you would want it to. When refinishing the doors, I try to keep the door open. I just find it to be a lot easier to handle, and I'm basically repeating the same process as the drawers where I just go along the outer edges. It's really difficult to not hit areas with the sander that you didn't mean to distress, and unfortunately this isn't a Bob Ross situation where every mistake is a happy mistake. If this happens, you can actually go ahead and take your finger or a paintbrush and dip it in the paint and just touch up those little areas that you did not mean to hit. Before I seal the furniture, I take a vacuum and just clean up any dust that was left inside after the distressing. For the outside of the furniture, I use a lint-free cloth. I find that a pillowcase works really well. I'm just going through really quick with some paint and touching up any areas that I feel like I might have missed. Prior to sealing, I make sure to shake the can thoroughly and hold it 8 inches away from the surface. The top of your furniture piece will need about 3 coats, and the drawers and sides will need 2. To put the hardware plating back on, I'm just taking those small nails and aligning them with the original holes, and then gently tapping with a hammer. Putting the newly refinished hardware back on at the very end is probably my favorite part of refinishing furniture. The only other thing I think I can compare it to is when you finish all of your makeup and you add those lashes at the very end. I've reached the final step of just reassembling all of the drawers. And that is that. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section and I'll try to answer them the best that I can. If you found this tutorial helpful, just make sure you follow me for more videos.